In this lecture, we're going to talk about the process of doing data analysis. And while data analysis can also apply to qualitative data, today we're going to mainly talk about quantitative types of data that are captured in numerical values and that can be analyzed using statistical methods. And this is not necessarily a lecture in statistical methods, but rather an introduction to how social scientists approach the process of analyzing data that's collected quantitatively through methods like surveys. You can think about quantitative data analysis in terms of 4 basic steps. In the first step, you're basically taking information that you've collected from the social world, such as a survey questionnaire that's completed by one of your respondents, and then kind of taking that relevant information and putting it into a form that can be readable by a computer and entered into a database that can be analyzed with statistical software. So you're taking information from questionnaires or survey instruments and transforming it into a computer-readable form. Another step in quantitative data analysis is really sort of involves a little bit of detecting and a little bit of cleaning, and basically you're sort of inspecting all of the data and making sure that it meets sort of rigorous standards for quality, and also sort of making some small changes and tweaks to the way that sort of data are represented and transforming the data and different variables into formats that are appropriate for different statistical analyses, whether they be bivariate or multivariate statistical analyses. Once you've inspected your data to make sure that it's clean and formatted appropriately, the next step is to begin sort of testing hypotheses related to your research question, usually by examining bivariate relationships, looking at how 2 variables are related to one another through methods like correlation coefficients and cross-tabulations. Even simple bivariate regression equations can be used to explore bivariate relationships. A final step in quantitative data analysis is usually more sophisticated multivariate analyses that allow you to model causal relationships between 3 or more variables. So this moves beyond bivariate relationships by introducing a 3rd or a 4th or even 5th, 6th, or 7th variable, and allowing you to sort of rule out different alternative explanations to really sort of nail down the contributing variables to sort of explain a certain social phenomenon. One of the early steps, once you've put your data into a computer-readable form, you've got to do a lot of what they call data processing. Data processing has been referred to as the least glamorous aspect of survey research. And I have a picture of a janitor mopping the floor because that's often about as much glamour as data processing usually receives. It's not the most glamorous job in survey research, but it's incredibly important. If data are not processed appropriately, a researcher can incur a lot of sort of errors and miscalculations in their data analysis and can lead to sort of invalid results. So data processing is really incredibly important for getting your data into shape, making sure that variables are coded appropriately, that the sort of the right values are entered for each variable, and that there are no errors in sort of that transmission process between the manual and the computer-readable forms of data. So there, you can think about data processing, preparing and processing data for analysis in terms of like 5 basic steps. The first step is coding. And in coding, you're sort of assigning numbers or symbols to different variable categories. So a very simple example of this might be, you indicate on a survey questionnaire whether a respondent is male, female, or some other sort of non-binary classification such as transgender. And you might kind of assign a number to each one of those categories. And those numbers do not necessarily indicate any order, But basically, they allow you to sort of take non-numerical information and assign numerical values to them so that they can be represented in statistical programs. So coding is sort of the process of assigning numbers or symbols to different variable categories within your survey study. There's also usually a second step involving editing. This is quality control checking of completed questionnaires, making sure that the responses that are entered on questionnaires are accurate, represent the true basis that was captured during the interview, that they are sort of logical responses that can be captured. So editing is sort of looking through the completed survey questionnaires and making sure that they meet the researcher's standard for quality control. Entry is also a process of is also a step in data processing. In entry, you're sort of entering data into a computer-readable spreadsheet. So usually a survey questionnaire can't be necessarily just scanned, but the data has to be sort of entered into a spreadsheet that can be read by a statistical software program. So data entry is sort of taking maybe the completed responses to a survey and getting them into a spreadsheet that can be imported into a statistical analysis program. Cleaning involves sort of looking through the data to make sure to identify and resolve any errors in data transmitted to the computer and imported into the statistical analysis program. Sometimes during the process of importing data into your computer program, there can be errors that arise. Either the program sort of misreads a column or a row and does not record the values of variables correctly. And so the researcher really has to go through and identify those errors and resolve them by sort of recoding variables or rereading data back into the computer program. A final step in data processing is inspecting and modifying. So you sort of have to look through all the data. Sometimes they call this exploratory data analysis. You're sort of getting a picture of the data by running frequency distributions and percentage distributions, identifying outliers in responses, maybe sort of categorizing and collapsing different values into new derived variables. So inspecting and modifying the data is kind of that final step of data processing before the researcher moves on to analysis. Once a researcher has a final data set that they're ready to begin analysis on, one of the important steps, especially when it's primary data collection, where the researcher collected the data themselves, usually they have to prepare a codebook. And a codebook, you can kind of think of it as a dictionary that defines all of the numerical codes that apply to each variable and variable category within the data file. So there might be a variable name, and you might have the question that was represented in the survey to sort of indicate that name. And then you have sort of values and codes that correspond to each category for a variable. So on this example on the screen, there was a variable called states. And states could have several categories, and each state, like Alabama, had a particular code. So Alabama was coded 1, Alaska was coded 2, Arizona was coded 3, and a codebook would sort of indicate all the different categories on a variable and the codes that were imported into the data set for that variable to represent each of the categories. And so a codebook is kind of like a dictionary for the entire data set. And usually, if you did not collect the data yourself, maybe you're downloading data that was collected by another researcher that's available on a public website like the ICPSR or the General Social Survey. Usually there's a code book that has already been prepared for you that you can download from a public website and review that code book to sort of understand what variables are captured within the data set and what the different codes are that represent different values on those variables. The next step, so inspecting and modifying the data, this is where you try to get a clear picture of the data by sort of looking closely at each variable in the data set. And usually data pictures is sort of one way to think about it, are generated by running different univariate analyses. So univariate means that you're looking at a single variable. And you can sort of represent results from univariate analysis in different ways. You can share tables, graphs, and charts. And I'll give some examples of these univariate visual representations of data that the researchers can produce to sort of get a picture of the distribution of data within your data set. There are several programs that you can use for statistical analysis of data in the social sciences. Three popular programs for statistical analysis include R. The benefit of R is that it's an open source program, and students and other researchers can download the program without any costs incurred to them. And it's a very powerful program because there's a community of people who have developed different, what they call packages for R to perform different statistical functions, even to retrieve data from social media websites like Twitter or even Reddit. SPSS is a program that's owned by IBM. It's probably one of the most widely used programs for statistical analysis. It's a little bit more user-friendly, and there's less of a learning curve for SPSS because it has, in addition to sort of coding, which is the main way of interacting with the R statistics program, SPSS even has a drop-down menu that you can use to run some simple statistical functions. Stata is popular within the social sciences, especially within sociology. People who do quantitative analysis in sociology. Stata is also a frequently used statistical analysis program. Both SPSS and Stata, there is a cost to obtaining the software license to install them on your computer, whereas R is open source and freely available. When you're looking at statistics and social research, you can kind of group statistics into two broad categories. The first is descriptive statistics. Descriptive statistics are functions for organizing and summarizing data, including sort of looking at the range of values, the high and the low scores, the frequency of values on a variable, and even things like measures of central tendency, means, modes, medians. I have the file cabinet as an indicator for descriptive statistics because it's kind of it's a way of getting the picture of your data. It's a way for sort of understanding the range of values, sort of categorizing values. Sometimes people run descriptive statistics to help them figure out how to transform variables for later inferential statistics or more complicated bivariate and multivariate models and hypothesis testing. And that's really what inferential statistics are geared towards understanding. Inferential statistics are those for determining generalizations from data. So usually survey research involves samples of a population. So you're not studying everybody within a population, but rather you're sampling people from a target population. And inferential statistics can allow you to sort of draw inferences or estimate population characteristics. But inferential statistics also include hypothesis testing, including specifying the relationships between two or more variables. So I have the dominoes as a visual picture for representing inferential statistics because hypothesis testing usually involves sort of specifying how two or more variables are related to one another. So you could think about sort of dominoes falling and hitting one another in a series, a logical series of actions. So thinking about some of those basic descriptive statistics, some of the so sort of two very simple ways for looking at your data descriptively include frequency and percentage distributions. Frequency distribution lists all of the response categories and identifies the number of cases that were observed for each category. And on the picture here, there's a frequency distribution of shoe size. So it has the shoe size has values that range from 6 to 10.5, And it shows the frequency of cases. There were 15 total cases in this data set. And it shows the frequency of observations for each shoe size. It also shows the percentage distribution, which is the category size relative to the size of the sample. For instance, one of the modal values in this data set was a shoe size of 7. A shoe size of 7 had 3 observations, and those 3 observations represented 20% of the total sample. So frequency and percentage distributions can really help you to understand, get kind of a visual picture of how values are sort of distributed on a variable within your data set. Once you've sort of looked at sort of frequency distributions, which were sort of appropriate for nominal and other categorical variables, if you have sort of more interval or ratio level variables, sometimes you have to sort of look at measures of central tendency and dispersion. And these are very appropriate for interval and ratio variables where maybe there's a large number of potential values that a variable can take on. And so it's difficult to just look at a frequency distribution because it really doesn't tell you the complete picture of how data are dispersed within your data set. So you might want to look at measures of what are called central tendency, how variables sort of center around a particular value. And 3 measures of central tendency include the mean, the median, and the mode. The mean is the simple arithmetic average. It's where you add up all the responses in your data set and you divide them by the number of values. It's the simple average response. The median is like a midpoint in a range of values. It's sort of the middle response variable, the middle response value, where half of values fall above that value and half of values fall below. It's sort of that 50% mark in the distribution of values on a variable. The mode is the value or the category with the highest frequency. So it's the value that's observed most frequently for a particular variable. You can think about the previous slide where we had the shoe size that had the greatest number of values. That would be the mode. It was the most frequently observed value within that variable. So in addition to these measures of central tendency, researchers might also sort of look at dispersion on a variable in responses within their data set for a particular variable. And you can look at the range, which is the difference between the highest and the lowest values, as a measure of dispersion. And you can also, sometimes when you calculate the mean, you also calculate the standard deviation, which is sort of the average spread of observations around that mean value. In addition to running frequency distributions, you can also sort of make visual representations of frequency distributions that can sort of be helpful for understanding sort of this dispersion of data around different values for a variable. And box plots and histograms are great ways of sort of representing frequency distributions in a visual way. So once you've completed your sort of basic descriptive analysis, you might be ready to sort of go into the inferential realm where you're testing hypotheses and you're running bivariate analyses, which are basically assessing relationships between 2 or more variables. So following sort of that inspection of the overall data set, researchers turn to empirical testing of bivariate relationships. And those are bivariate analyses, which basically assess the relationships between 2 variables. And some of the basic ways for conducting bivariate analysis, so if you have 2 categorical variables, 2 variables that have nominal or ordinal scales, you can usually do a cross tabulation, in which it sort of compares the responses on 2 variables, and the rows represent categories of one variable while the columns represent categories of another variable. And what this allows you to do, if you pair a cross tabulation with a chi-square test for independence, this allows you to sort of compare the observed versus the expected frequencies which within each of the cells on that cross-tabulation test. And so a chi-square test for independence assumes that there's no relationship between those two variables. But if there is a deviation in the observed versus the expected frequencies, the chi-square test will indicate a value that might be statistically significant, which suggests that the researcher has observed a relationship between two variables in their data set. In addition to the cross-tabulation, measures of association, like a correlation coefficient, are helpful for indicating the strength of an association between two interval or ratio level variables, and correlation coefficients and measures of association, they indicate two things. They indicate the strength of a relationship, sort of whether the values range from 0 of no association to plus or minus 1, a perfect association. It also, depending on whether it's plus or minus, that also indicates the direction of the association. So a correlation coefficient indicates the strength of the association as well as the direction of that association. A final stage in data analysis with quantitative data from surveys and other types of quantitative studies is multivariate analysis. In multivariate analysis, you're using multivariate statistical models to sort of represent theorized relationships among 3 or more variables. And one of the popular ways of conducting multivariate analysis in the social sciences is something called multiple regression. And multiple regression is an extension of bivariate regression, and it examines the impact of 2 or more independent variables on a dependent variable. So it allows you, it's basically a mathematical equation that indicates sort of the observed effect of 2 or more independent variables on a dependent variable y, the variable that you're trying to explain.